My name is Daniel, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Ashwood Grove. It's the kind of place with trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and a homeowners association that takes itself far too seriously. But this isn't a story about lawns or mailboxes. This is a story about a 20-foot flagpole, a woman named Karen, and the 3 longest years of my life. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some battles aren't won with arguments. They're won with patience, timing, and a little bit of poetic justice. It all started the summer my father passed away. He was a veteran, a proud one, the kind of man who stood a little straighter every time the national anthem played. When he died, he left me a small inheritance, a box of medals, and one very specific request. He wanted a flagpole installed in front of my house, tall enough to be seen from the street, strong enough to survive a storm, and dignified enough to honor his memory. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't a decoration. It was a promise I made to a man who spent 30 years serving his country. So that August, I hired a local company, ordered a 20-foot aluminum flagpole, checked with the city to make sure I had every permit in order, and installed it myself with the help of 2 neighbors. I planted it in the front corner of my yard, away from the sidewalk, angled so it wouldn't interfere with anyone's view. I raised the flag for the first time on a Sunday evening, and for about 6 days, everything was peaceful. Then Karen moved in. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Not every neighbor named Karen is a problem, and this isn't about mocking anyone's name. I'm using it here because, frankly, it fits the story so well that even she would probably laugh about it now, though back then, laughing was the last thing on my mind. Karen lived 2 houses down, in a home with an unnervingly perfect garden and a habit of walking her small dog past my house at exactly 7:15 every morning. The first time I saw her stop and stare at my flagpole, I thought maybe she was admiring it. She was not. I still remember the morning I raised that flag for the first time. It was quiet, just after sunrise, the neighborhood still mostly asleep except for a jogger or 2 and a sprinkler system ticking away somewhere down the block. I clipped the flag to the halyard, pulled the rope hand over hand, and watched the fabric catch the early light as it climbed. I thought about my father's funeral, about the flag that had been folded into a tight triangle and handed to me by a young officer in dress uniform, and about the promise I'd made under my breath as I held it. Standing there that morning, I felt like I had finally kept that promise. For about a week, that feeling lasted. By the end of that first week, I received my first notice from the homeowners association. Apparently, someone had reported that my flagpole was aesthetically disruptive to the neighborhood's visual harmony. I remember reading that letter 3 times because I couldn't believe those words were used in a real document. I called the HOA office, and the woman on the phone told me the complaint had come from a resident who wished to remain anonymous. I didn't need a name. I already had a pretty good idea. I responded to the notice by providing my permit documentation, the manufacturer's compliance certificate, and a copy of the county ordinance that explicitly allowed flagpoles up to 25 feet on residential property. The HOA reviewed it and closed the complaint. I thought that would be the end of it. It was only the beginning. 2 months later, a new complaint arrived. This time, it claimed the flagpole created a glare hazard from the reflective finish catching sunlight in the evening. I have to admit, I laughed out loud when I read that one. My flagpole was matte aluminum. It didn't glare any more than a parked car in a driveway. Still, I had to respond, again with documentation, again waiting weeks for the HOA to review and dismiss it. This became a pattern. Every few months, a new complaint would surface. The flagpole was too tall. The rope made noise at night. The shadow crossed onto a neighboring lawn during certain hours. The flag itself, my father's flag, folded and raised with more care than almost anything else in my life, was apparently too large for a residential setting, despite being a completely standard size sold by thousands of retailers across the country. One complaint claimed the pole's halyard clanged against the aluminum shaft on windy nights, disturbing sleep 2 houses away. I responded by installing a rubber dampener, an inexpensive fix that solved a problem I hadn't even known existed, and I submitted photos as proof. Another complaint suggested the flagpole's base, a simple concrete footing buried below the frost line exactly as required by code, posed a long-term structural risk to neighboring foundations, a claim so vague and so clearly outside the realm of what a concrete footing 4 feet underground could possibly cause that even the HOA's own compliance officer seemed embarrassed reading it aloud during our brief phone call. Still, procedure was procedure, and I had to respond formally, in writing, every single time. I began to notice a strange rhythm to it all. The complaints tended to arrive shortly after any kind of community gathering, a block party, a holiday cookout, an HOA open house, almost as if something at those events reignited whatever frustration was driving them. I didn't think much of it at first. I was too busy compiling paperwork to notice patterns. But looking back now, it's obvious that each event gave Karen a fresh look at the flagpole, and a fresh reason to feel like something needed to be done about it. I want you to understand something about how this affected me. This wasn't just an annoyance. Every letter from the HOA felt like an attack on something deeply personal. My father was gone, and this flagpole was one of the last physical things connecting me to the promise I made him. Every complaint felt like someone trying to take that away, piece by piece, technicality by technicality. By the end of the first year, I had filed 4 and received 7 separate rulings in my favor. Every single complaint had been dismissed because I had done everything by the book. But that didn't stop them from coming. If anything, the complaints seemed to get more creative as the months passed. I started keeping a folder. Not out of paranoia, but simple practicality. A physical folder with every letter, every permit, every response, every ruling. By the middle of the second year, that folder had grown thick enough that I needed a second one. Somewhere around month 18, I finally had direct proof of who was behind it. I was walking my own dog early one morning when I saw Karen standing at the edge of her lawn, phone raised, clearly taking photos of my flagpole. When she noticed me watching, she didn't even flinch. She simply said, "That thing is a hazard, you know. One day it's going to fall on someone's car." I asked her, calmly, why she cared so much about a flagpole that had been engineered, permitted, and inspected multiple times over the past year and a half. She told me it just didn't belong in a neighborhood like ours. I asked her what she meant by that, genuinely curious rather than confrontational. She hesitated, glanced at the flagpole, then back at me, and said something along the lines of wanting the neighborhood to feel cohesive, that every yard should follow the same unspoken visual rhythm, and that a 20-foot pole standing alone on a corner lot broke that rhythm in a way she found difficult to ignore. It was such an oddly specific complaint, delivered with such total sincerity, that I didn't know whether to be frustrated or simply sad for her. Somewhere in that conversation, I realized this wasn't really about ordinances or safety standards at all. It never had been. I remember standing there, holding my dog's leash, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to resolve. I realized then that this wasn't about safety, or aesthetics, or noise. This was about control. Karen wanted the neighborhood to look a certain way, and anything that didn't fit her vision was a target, regardless of how legal or harmless it actually was. From that point forward, I stopped taking the complaints personally and started treating them like a long, slow chess match. I documented everything with even more precision. I had the flagpole re-inspected annually, even when it wasn't required, just so I'd have fresh paperwork ready. I learned the exact wording of every relevant city ordinance and HOA bylaw. I became, without really planning to, something of an amateur expert in flagpole regulations. By the second anniversary of the flagpole's installation, I had accumulated 17 dismissed complaints. 17. Neighbors started to notice the pattern too. A few of them, quietly and without wanting to get involved directly, told me they'd seen Karen out at odd hours, examining the flagpole, measuring shadows with her phone, and once, allegedly, trying to peer at the base of the pole with a flashlight late at night. Around this time, I also started attending the HOA's monthly meetings in person, something I hadn't bothered with before. I figured if my flagpole was going to keep coming up as an agenda item, I should at least be present to speak for myself rather than relying on written responses alone. Those meetings were an education in themselves. I watched neighbors argue over paint colors, mailbox styles, and the precise shade of beige allowed on garage doors. I watched Gerald, the board president, try valiantly to keep order among a room full of people who all seemed convinced their particular grievance was the most urgent item on the agenda. And every month, without fail, someone would bring up my flagpole, usually followed by a long pause, a few exchanged glances, and Gerald reluctantly opening the floor for discussion. I'll admit there were moments during that second year where I considered just taking the flagpole down. Not because I thought Karen was right, but because the constant cycle of letters and hearings was exhausting. I'd come home from work to find another HOA envelope waiting, and my stomach would drop before I even opened it. But every time I thought about giving up, I thought about my father, standing straighter during the anthem, and I knew I couldn't let a stranger's obsession erase that. Then, near the start of year 3, something happened that changed everything. I run a small consulting business, mostly helping local companies streamline their operations and finances. It's steady work, not glamorous, but it introduced me to all kinds of small business owners across the region. One of my longtime clients happened to mention, almost in passing, that the flagpole company I originally bought my pole from, a modest but respected regional manufacturer called Summit Flag and Pole Company, was struggling. The founder, a man in his 70s named Harold, was ready to retire, and the business had no clear succession plan. Harold had built the company from nothing over 4 decades, supplying flagpoles to schools, veterans' halls, government buildings, and homes across 3 states. But without a buyer, it was at risk of simply closing down. I remember sitting in my car after that meeting, turning the idea over in my head. I wasn't a flagpole expert. I wasn't looking to change careers. But something about the timing felt significant. This was the company that had manufactured the very flagpole my father asked me to install. This was the company whose engineering certificates I had used, over and over, to defend that flagpole against baseless complaint after baseless complaint. And now it needed someone to step in and keep it running. I reached out to Harold directly. We met for coffee, and I told him honestly why I was interested. Not for profit, not for some grand business strategy, but because his company's flagpole had become something meaningful to me, and I didn't want to see it disappear. Harold, it turned out, was a veteran himself, and when I told him the story about my father and the 3 years of complaints, he laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Some folks, he said, just can't stand seeing something stand tall. Harold showed me around the small manufacturing facility a few weeks later, a modest warehouse on the edge of town filled with rows of raw aluminum tubing, spools of halyard rope, and a back office lined with filing cabinets that hadn't seen a proper organizational overhaul in years. He walked me through the history of the company, how he'd started it in his garage after leaving the service, how he'd slowly built relationships with schools and municipalities across the region, and how proud he was that Summit poles stood in front of courthouses, fire stations, and family homes just like mine. He told me that every pole that left his warehouse carried a little piece of that pride with it, and that he'd always taken it personally when a customer had trouble with an installation, even when that trouble had nothing to do with the pole itself. When I told him about the 3 years of complaints, he shook his head slowly and said he'd heard variations of that story more times than he could count over the decades. Homeowners associations treating a simple, legal, well-installed flagpole like a public menace, usually because of one particularly determined neighbor. People don't complain about the pole, he told me. They complain about what it represents to them. Half the time it's got nothing to do with the actual thing sitting in the yard. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. Over the following months, we worked out the details. I used part of my inheritance, took out a modest business loan, and restructured my consulting schedule to make room for a new role, co-owner and operations director of Summit Flag and Pole Company. It wasn't about revenge. I want to be honest about that. It was about preserving something my father valued, something that represented craftsmanship and integrity in an industry most people never think twice about. But here's where the story takes its turn. As part of taking over operations, I spent weeks going through Summit's records, installation histories, engineering certifications, warranty claims, inspection reports going back decades. And in doing so, I discovered something I hadn't expected. Ashwood Grove's own community center, the building where our HOA held its monthly meetings, had a flagpole installed by Summit almost 15 years earlier. And according to the county's updated zoning code, adopted just 2 years prior, that flagpole exceeded the current height restriction by nearly 4 feet. It had never been recertified. It had never been flagged. It had simply been standing there, technically out of compliance, for 2 full years, right under the nose of the very association that had spent 3 years scrutinizing mine down to the shadow it cast at sunset. I didn't rush to expose this. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys pulling out a gotcha just for the satisfaction of it. Instead, I brought the discovery to the HOA board through the proper channel, a formal compliance notice, the same kind I had received 17 times over the previous 2 years, except this time, it was Summit Flag and Pole Company issuing a professional notice regarding an out-of-compliance structure on association property. The response was almost immediate. Suddenly, the same board that had taken weeks or months to review my complaints was scrambling to schedule an emergency session. And at that meeting, for the first time in 3 years, I sat not as the accused, but as the owner of the very company whose engineering standards the entire association relied on for every flagpole ruling in the neighborhood, including every single complaint that had been filed against me. Karen was there too, of course. She always attended these meetings, usually to reiterate her concerns about my flagpole one more time. But this time, when the board opened the floor, the topic wasn't my flagpole at all. It was the community centre's non-compliant pole, and the awkward, uncomfortable truth that the very body responsible for enforcing height restrictions had been sitting on a violation for 2 years without noticing. I chose my words carefully that night. I didn't gloat. I didn't bring up the 17 complaints, though everyone in that room certainly remembered them. I simply explained, calmly and professionally, that as the new operator of Summit Flag and Pole Company, I had reviewed historical installation records as part of a routine internal audit, and I felt obligated to bring the discrepancy to the board's attention, just as any responsible company would. The board president, a soft-spoken man named Gerald who had personally signed off on at least 4 of my 17 dismissed complaints, looked visibly uncomfortable. He thanked me for bringing it forward and assured the room that the community center's pole would be brought into compliance immediately. Then something happened that I hadn't fully anticipated. One of the newer board members, a woman who had joined only a year earlier and had grown visibly tired of the endless flagpole saga, asked a simple but pointed question. How many complaints, in total, had been filed against private residences for flagpole-related issues over the past 3 years, and how many of those had originated from a single source? The HOA's administrative assistant, flipping through records, confirmed that of the total complaints filed regarding residential flagpoles in Ashwood Grove over the past 3 years, the overwhelming majority, every single one, in fact, had been filed against one address. Mine. And while HOA records don't typically disclose the identity of anonymous complainants, it didn't take long for the room to connect the dots. Karen had been vocal, publicly and repeatedly, about my flagpole at nearly every meeting for 3 years. She wasn't shy about her opinions. She just hadn't expected the pattern to be laid out so plainly, in a room full of neighbors who were, by this point, thoroughly exhausted by the entire saga. I want to be fair to Karen here, because this story isn't really about villainizing one person. When the meeting ended, she approached me, not with hostility, but with something closer to embarrassment. She admitted that she'd become fixated on the flagpole early on, back when it first went up, because it reminded her of a dispute she had years earlier in a previous neighborhood, one that had genuinely resulted in property damage from a poorly installed pole. She said she never meant for it to become what it became, but once she started, she didn't know how to stop without feeling like she'd lost. I appreciated her honesty, even if it came 3 years too late. I told her I understood the fear behind her concern, even if the way it played out had cost both of us a great deal of time, stress, and community goodwill. We didn't become friends overnight. I don't think either of us expected that. But something shifted after that meeting. The complaints stopped. Not gradually, completely, immediately, and permanently. The community center's flagpole was replaced within a month, properly certified this time by, appropriately enough, Summit Flag and Pole Company. Harold, now fully retired, sent me a short note when he heard how everything had unfolded. It simply said, "Your father would be proud, and not just because of the flag." In the weeks following that meeting, the shift in the neighborhood's general attitude was almost tangible. Neighbors who had quietly avoided the subject for years suddenly felt comfortable bringing it up, usually to tell me they'd suspected the source of the complaints all along but hadn't wanted to get involved in a dispute that wasn't theirs. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived across the street, told me he'd almost said something to the board a year earlier after overhearing Karen on her phone complaining about that flagpole situation to a friend, but he'd talk himself out of it, not wanting to stir up more conflict than already existed. I understood his hesitation completely. Getting involved in something like this rarely feels worth the trouble, even when you know exactly what's going on. Gerald, to his credit, reached out to me personally about a week after the meeting. He admitted that the board had likely been too quick to process each new complaint without stepping back to look at the broader pattern, and he apologized for the toll it had taken on me over the years. He also mentioned, somewhat sheepishly, that the board was considering a new policy requiring repeat complaints about the same structure to go through a more rigorous internal review before being forwarded to the homeowner, specifically to prevent this kind of prolonged situation from happening to anyone else. I appreciated the gesture, even if it came later than I would have liked. Owning Summit changed more than just the outcome of my personal dispute. Over the following year, I worked with our small team to modernize record keeping, improve compliance documentation for every customer, and make sure no other family would have to spend 3 years defending something as simple as a flagpole with the same intensity one did. We started offering a compliance packet with every installation, permits, engineering certificates, and a clear explanation of local ordinances, so homeowners would never again have to scramble the way I did during that first difficult year. Looking back on those 3 years, I don't think of them as wasted, even though there were plenty of nights I felt exhausted, frustrated, and unfairly targeted. Those years taught me the value of patience, the importance of documentation, and the quiet power of simply continuing to do things the right way, even when someone else seems determined to make that difficult. They also, unexpectedly, led me into an entirely new chapter of my professional life, one connected directly to the memory of my father. Today, the flagpole still stands in the same corner of my yard, exactly where it did on that Sunday evening 3 years ago. The flag still goes up every morning and comes down every evening, folded the way my father taught me. Karen still walks her dog past my house at 7:15, though these days, she gives a small wave instead of a lingering stare. Every now and then, a new resident moves into Ashwood Grove and asks about the tall flagpole on the corner lot, curious about its history. I usually just tell them it belonged to my father, and that it stood there through a lot more than most people would guess. I leave out most of the details about the 17 complaints, the countless HOA letters, and the strange twist of fate that led me to buy the very company that made it. But if they ask why I got into the flagpole business, I tell them the truth. Sometimes the best way to protect something you love isn't to fight harder. It's to understand the system so completely that no one can use it against you again. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, the universe hands you exactly the tool you need to make things right, 20 feet tall and standing proud in the wind. That's the story of how a small aluminum flagpole, a determined neighbor, and 3 long years of complaints led me to become the owner of the very company that made it. And how, in the end, the truth stood taller than any complaint ever could.